Thanks, Rob, and thanks to the organizers for bringing us all together. So following Nathan's instructions today, I wanted to kind of provide a broad overview of how my colleagues and I, taking a kind of gene culture coevolutionary approach, think about social norms. I think one strength of this is that it may allow us to deal with a lot of the definitional issues, because I'm looking at the evolution of social norms, so they're kind of going to change definitions as we move through human evolutionary time. So the first thing I want to talk about is just how you get from cultural transmission. So we have an ape species, something like a chimp 6 million years ago. At some point our species crosses the threshold of cumulative cultural evolution, where cumulative culture begins to aggregate over generations. We get increasingly good at learning from each other, and then eventually we can get to social norms. So this is going to begin with cultural transmission. I put this note here about institutions and norm packages, because one of the discussions that I'd like to have, or potentially have, with my economist colleagues is within economics there's this sense to create a dichotomy between cultural explanations on the one hand and institutional explanations on the other. It's my contention that that approach is unproductive, and that we should think of institutions as packages of social norms. So we culturally acquire social norms, they form groups of norms that say govern marriage, and that's what we call institutions. Now you might want to call those informal institutions and then later layer on some written laws and things like that, but it all builds up through the same process. No need to dichotomize. I'm going to make the case that some of the ways that we've thought about social norms has been to try to figure out what the explanation is for how norms are stable. So oftentimes this is phrased in terms of explaining cooperation, and there are people who prefer what they might call reputation models, people who prefer punishment models. I'm going to make the case that cultural evolution is much more creative than that it's come up with a diversity of different ways to sustain norms, and we should be kind of cataloging them. So we're naturalists now. We're cataloging how different societies have managed to sustain social norms in different ways. And different domains of social norms could actually have different ways of maintaining them. I'll say a little bit now, as we move down here, this gets less and less likely that I'll get to these topics. So our evolved social norm psychology, so through this gene culture coevolutionary process, I'm going to make the case that humans have some genetically evolved features of our psychology that help us navigate a world constructed of social rules that get sanctioned and incentivized in various ways. I think that these intergroup competition can shape these, along with other processes that affect which norms are more likely to succeed based on how they affect group performance. And then finally, if I get to this last part, I think by structuring institutions, structuring societies, norms shape our cultural psychology. So individuals have to adapt to the social worlds they find themselves in. Throughout most of human history, these worlds were governed by strong kinship norms that created dense and overlapping networks with lots of rules about marriage. We don't live in that world anymore, but I think some of this psychological variation that we find across societies can trace to this social world that individuals have to adapt to, both ontogenetically and also over cultural evolutionary time as different strategies get favored. So this is from a paper that I did with Maciek Chudik in 2013. It tries to lay out our picture of how all this works. So, that was bad. Okay, all right, somewhere up here. Within group socioecology is the first one, then psychological adaptations, and then between group social ecology. So this is, as you see the first one there, this is what I've already explained, that there was some process, which I'll leave silent for now, led humans to cross this threshold. Culture became extremely important. We began to rely on it to acquire all kinds of ideas, beliefs, technologies, tools for our very survival. As culture accumulates, so more tools, knowledge about shelter, tracking, knowledge about edible plants, this large body of cultural information, the name of the genetic evolutionary game is to create brains that are best able to extract all that valuable adaptive know-how from the larger social world. And it's the evolution of this cultural learning psychology that I think opens the door for the emergence of social norms. All right, so zooming in here a little bit. I now want to talk about this, and I just want to say a little bit about it, about our cultural learning psychology, because I think that this is what the same psychology that allows us to learn social norms, and then later we'll add on the norm psychology. So the way we approach this, the kind of culture gene coevolutionary world, is to think about how natural selection has shaped our minds to best extract information from the minds and behaviors of those around us. So this is quite a formal process, so there's lots of evolutionary models considering how different strategies and cues can evolve and how they weigh against other strategies and cues. So just to give you a quick sense of some of the work out there, so one class of mechanisms is context mechanisms. So the first one there, model-based, is a subclass that is who we should pay attention to. So using cues of success, prestige, skill, ethnicity, age, sex, all to zoom in on those individuals most likely to possess adaptive behavior that you can acquire by social learnings. Another area of research is on conformist transmission. So how do we integrate information? So different people are doing different things. There's some distribution of behaviors or preferences through the group. How do you decide which one to adopt? And then content-based mechanisms. So there's some domains of culture are more important than others. Some we should organize or think about in particular ways. So people seem to have particular interest in food. They think about artifacts in particular ways as distinct from living kinds and biological species. I think we're particularly interested in social norms. I'll get to that in a few minutes. And we seem to have some specialized psychology for thinking about social groups, for carving the social landscape, creating ethnic groups and things like that. And of course, we pay attention to payoffs. So we have some ability to evaluate payoffs. I usually ignore that one, but I put it in for you guys. All right, and this is again me beating up economists. A lot of economic models of cultural transmission assume vertical transmission. I feel like the one thing we know is that humans do a lot more besides vertical transmission. And if you were to take an empirical approach and say, how do humans learn, you would never want to build a cultural transmission model with only vertical transmission, I contend. Now, that doesn't mean that vertical transmission plays no role. So in our work in Fiji, we show that young children tend to learn from members of their family. And as they get older, they begin to look at the wider social world. So there's a kind of life history to this. Okay. So now getting to social norms. So same social learning mechanisms that are used for everything else, acquiring tools. You can acquire behaviors, strategies, preferences, or beliefs. And then you can acquire the standards for judging others. So when someone does a particular behavior or uses a certain strategy, how do you judge them? How do you evaluate them? And once you have those two things, you can get some kind of social norm through a variety of different ways. This red line is just to suggest that you may have certain preferences for judging criteria once you've acquired a preference or belief. So these two may be linked in some way. But then you can interact with these standards for judging others and the actual behavior, and then that can create locally stable norms once individuals begin evaluating and deciding what they think of others based on their behavior. Lots of different ways. Actively punish, take other people's stuff when they have a bad reputation or violate a norm, or have refused to interact, ostracism. So lots of different mechanisms. And I just wanted to mention also, it's often missed that humans rely a lot on reputations, and so a lot of these will take advantage of reputation. But reputational, or information about other people's reputation, is largely culturally transmitted itself. So the exact same mechanisms that we use to acquire here, we can deploy to acquire reputational information. So it's mostly not due to how it is in cleaner fish, where you see another fish behave in a certain way, and that tells you about this fish. We're using what other people say about other people to create an aggregate picture of individuals. So it's a product of cultural learning. Okay, now I'm going to move into this area, which we're going to make the case that there are lots of different ways that societies have sustained norms. And so here are just 3 examples that are in the literature. So these are all either one or more formal models that aim to explain cooperation. They all result in not only explaining cooperation, but also explaining anything. So they can stabilize anything independent of the benefits that behavior delivers. The costs, of course, matter, but not the benefits. So diffuse costly punishment. So these are cooperators and punishers. We talked a little bit about this yesterday. Positive indirect reciprocity. So this is a reputational model. Rob Boyd and Karthik Panjanathan did the first paper on this that I know of in 2004 in Nature. So in that model, you have a 2-person interaction, a helping game where you can help another individual. And then you have a public goods game. Remember, the benefits in the public goods game can be 0, so it's really a norm game. And then if you violate the norm in the public goods game, you get a bad reputation, you fall into bad standing, and then it's okay for them not to help you. And then that'll lead to a stable system where you have cooperators and people helping, and it's all good. It also has an equilibrium at don't help. Diffuse costly punishment also has that feature of multiple equilibria. And then signaling models. So one example would be Herb Gintis's and colleagues' model in 2001, where individuals can cooperate or punish others as a signal of their quality, and then this then benefits them in getting allies and things like that. So it affects their reputation. Turns out there's lots of different ways, and creating models with multiple stable equilibria is pretty easy because in the cultural world, you can add all kinds of things besides payoff bias transmission. You can add conformity, and that'll make number one work pretty well. You can add other features of cultural transmission that I won't get into. One thing that we haven't thought enough about here is evolved anchors. So I used marriage as my example of a case where we have an institution with a bunch of norms, but marriage is clearly built on our pair bonding psychology. Like other apes, like gorillas, we have a pair bonding psychology, and then marriage is this cluster of norms that form around it. Okay, so the properties of these various ways to create social norms have cooperative equilibria, like cooperative house building. Individuals get together after a hurricane. People might make joint sacrifices to the ancestors. There could be a norm that after a male relative dies, you cut your finger off at the joint. And then each time a male relative dies, you cut another finger off at the joint. So in the highlands of New Guinea, when Western populations first arrived there, they found many women that had their fingers cut off, some of them with all of their fingers cut off, because they were following the local normative practice out of respect for the ancestors. And then there's always the do-nothing equilibria. People don't even recognize that anybody should do anything at all. Okay, this is just making the same point I just made, that there's lots of maladaptive norms. So whatever our theory, it should be able to account for the presence of lots of maladaptive norms as well as cooperative norms. So just some quick examples. There's lots of food taboos where people who rely on subsistence, hunting and gathering, will taboo foods that are potentially valuable sources of protein and calories. Now, I've argued that some food taboos are adaptive, and if you look deep enough, you find adaptive logic behind them. But for lots of other food taboos, that seems like a tough sell, and they're probably just maladaptive. Female infibulation, locally required if you want to get a marriage partner, but clearly bad for fitness, for sure, to cut off the clitoris. Lots of rituals are maladaptive. So the famous one is the case of Kuru in New Guinea, where people eat their dead ancestors as a way of imbuing with the spirit and sense of their ancestors. But this leads to the transmission of a horrible prion disease, which eventually causes death. Rob uses the idea of Melanesian yam competition in his book. So men compete to grow yams. They try to grow bigger and bigger yams, but the yams get so big, they're like this big, you carry them with a spike, but you can't eat them then. So all the men are working as hard as they can to produce giant yams that are largely inedible. So not clearly. And then, of course, there's the practice of neckties, which has always baffled me. You wrap colorful bands of cloth around your neck, you choke yourself. We require elder statesmen to do this. Okay. So I went to Fiji to study some of these things, and so this is a subsistence economy on outer islands, one of the outer islands. So people do a lot of fishing and marine gathering, horticulture, they plant yams. There's actually some yam competitions. Cassava, breadfruit, lots of calories from subsistence. These are chiefdoms, so everybody lives in a complex social organization. Hierarchical chief, skip that. So what I wanted to do here was take these different models for the evolution of cooperation and figure out what this should look like on the ground, and then study how people actually live their lives. So here, I took out 10 of them actually. Here's 2, diffuse punishment and that dyadic helping model I described. And I looked at the features. So the diffuse punishment, you should see punishment. The reputation of the punisher shouldn't go down. In the withdrawal help model, you don't see that here. You should see it here. And I studied a bunch of norms to see what we would find. So anonymity would be great in a diffuse punishment model because you avoid counter punishment. Doesn't matter over there. Well, actually, you need to know people standing over there, so you can't have anonymity. So these things make different predictions about what you should see on the ground. So I studied a bunch of different norms. So whether people worked in cooperative labor in the village, whether people rested on Sundays, whether people married their classificatory sisters, contributed to the village feasts, worked on the chief's yam, so all local norms. And we did vignette studies. We gathered actual cases, so it was an ethnographic study over several years. We asked about what would happen if a person did this, how would they be sanctioned, all kinds of things like that. And then we gathered real cases, like I mentioned. Okay, and so after testing all these models, it was clear that all of the models failed, that the basic conditions didn't hold. So just to give you some examples, people said, most of the time no one would ever punish, this would be a bad thing, so that's not good for diffuse costly punishment. But a few people would punish, and they'd be motivated by long simmering jealousies, that they get a chance to take out their long running jealousies because the person fell into bad standing. Other time would be motivation just theft. If someone falls into bad standing, you can steal stuff from them with impunity, where normally that would be a big problem. Under no circumstances would people withdraw help from those who violated norms. Interestingly, the kids thought people would withdraw help, but the adults were like, no, that would be terrible. Reputation of the punisher, you can't go down there, it can't go down here. It goes down a little bit if caught, but it turns out you can mostly get away with this because all the third parties are like, nah, we're not too interested in investigating this. And then mostly you maintain anonymity in this stuff, so you can't actually go after the person who punishes you. Okay, so that's the system we found. It has a bunch of these features. I've kind of already described it. So people do get sanctioned, but it harnesses the existing jealousies. The anonymity means you avoid cycles of violence that can be created by punishment in small groups. The other forms of helping are sacrosanct. You can't interfere with them, so you can't use them as leverage. And maybe it provides an outlet for these long simmering jealousies. So living in these villages is like living with the people you went to high school with your whole life. So people are still mad about that thing that happened 30 years ago when you got the girl and now every day he sees you married, or he sees them and together and that kind of thing. So then that took us back to the laboratory. So back to the theoretical laboratory. So we built a mathematical model kind of on the style that Rob and Karthik did, where we have a two-person exploitation game. So individuals randomly have a chance to exploit each other, and cooperating is choosing not to exploit. And then we attach it to a public goods game. So if you don't deliver the public goods or you violate the norm, you go into bad standing, now I can steal from you. So now I can get a direct benefit by taking your stuff, whereas before I couldn't do it because then I'd fall into bad standing and everybody would take my stuff. So this creates a stable equilibrium. Seems to fit the basic patterns, which is good since I built it to fit the basic patterns. I've kind of gone through these. Some cool aspects is that it harnesses exploitation, this desire to take out these simmering jealousies, to create a more harmonious group. So I think it opens the door for more positive forms of reciprocity. If you're exploiting each other, you can't get the more positive stuff going, or at least it would be harder. We noticed that when we did the math, it requires less cognition. So in this case, in the typical indirect reciprocity model, you have to have agreement on that someone failed to act. So there has to be an opportunity to help, someone has to not do anything. We have to all agree that there was an opportunity to help for which someone can then be punished for. In this, doing nothing doesn't matter. You don't have to track that. You just have to track when someone exploits someone, was that person in good standing? And so you have to pay attention to less. All right. Skip that. There were a couple features that I'll just mention that weren't covered by the model. So there were a few cases we found where a big guy, there was a norm violation in the village, and a big guy just went and beat up the little guy. 5 minutes left? Okay. A big guy went and beat up the little guy. And we would ask about that, and it seems like the motivation for the big guy is that he can show what a tough guy is, and the only time he can do that is if the individual is in bad standing. Because if you were to just beat up someone in good standing, then people would steal your crops at night and inflict other kind of punishments on you. So it's a chance for the tough guys to signal their toughness that they normally are suppressed from doing. So it sort of harnesses this desire to signal dominance, which is otherwise suppressed in the community. And then finally, the other thing that came up in the interviews was that a lot of people said that the village curse would be in effect. And so this is basically a witchcraft type belief. So people have murky and different conceptions of how exactly this works. So some people think that it's the ancestor gods punishing. So someone does something bad and then they get bitten by a shark, or a relative of theirs falls out of a tree and gets injured, say a child. So they see this stuff in action and they attribute it to norm violations. Now, sometimes it's not the ancestor god. Some people would say, the word they use in Fijian is Sanivanua, which means sword of the community. And so there's this, the description is kind of like the anger that's built up among the community at the norm violations has a physical force in the world. And it somehow does bad things to people to which that bad feeling is aimed at. And you find this kind of recurrent in lots of ethnography. So that's also out there, not sure how to put that into the game theory. All right. Okay, and just a quick look at some experiments. So we did the ultimatum game with the Fijians in 2003, the same village. And I think you can see the logic of this working in the experiment. So this is the amount of the offer, and this is the percentage of rejections for each of the possible offers. So we did it strategy method. We put 1 day's wage on the line. As reference, we also did the exact same experiment with students at Emory University. So you can see that the Emory students here in black, if you offer them 0, 100% of Emory students will punish you first. That's such a low offer. And then you get this declining frequency of punishment until you get to 50%. And then Emory students, just like lots of Westerners, stop punishing. The Fijians, only a little under 30% of Fijians will punish you for 0. And then you get to this low thing, and then it goes to 0 at 50. So people don't want to punish. So they make high offers in the ultimatum game, 39%, relatively high offers, but no punishment. And that's because Fijians don't punish. Punishment is completely suppressed unless you have this simmering grievance where you can get away with it. But otherwise, it's not part of your psychology, right? And like lots of societies, there also is this increasing punishment for offers that are too high. 2 minutes. Okay. And then finally, I'll just say something about norm psychology. So the process I've laid out here is that you can get to these kind of stabilizing mechanisms through just cultural transmission. But then humans are genetically evolving in a world where they're getting bad reputations and being sanctioned and having their stuff stolen at night for norm violations, whether they be errors or intentional. And then so we develop a psychology that helps us stick to norms and acquire norms. So the first thing, and this one is the hardest one to test, but I think that humans have a norm ontology, which means animals have to recognize different species in the world and tools and things like that. But humans think of the world as full of social rules. So in order to navigate the world, you might not know what the social rules are, but in order to have any chance of figuring them out, you have to assume they exist. So children come into the world thinking they're going to enter a rule-governed world. Rapid norm learning, so if they see a widely shared pattern, you can do lots of experiments with little kids, they'll immediately see it as a should experiment, a should situation. So you take off your shoes when you come inside, well, you should take off your shoes inside, and daddy, if you don't take off your shoes, you're violating a rule. They respond negatively to deviations from widely shared patterns, even if they've never been told it's wrong, or instruction patterns. So many of you have heard of the Tomasello experiments with Max. And children react pretty strongly. We've talked about the internalization of norms. So this is a rich area, I think, for research that there's not enough research on. It seems clear to me, at least I think a good case can be made that humans internalize norms, but the evolutionary reasons why humans internalize norms are less clear. So Sergey presented one model. I think another model is that it's just a fast and frugal heuristic that allows you to navigate the world without tracking a lot of information. It might also solve a time delay problem. So humans are not so good with delay discounting. And when you commit an act now, you often get a direct benefit, but the reputational consequences are probabilistic and in some distant future. So it might help you deal with the temporal discounting. I'm out of time. Humans are also good at spotting norm violators. And you might want to look at these books if you want to learn more.
Okay.
Alex.
I know you've worked in Fiji for a long time. Do you have a particular perspective on the last 1,000 years and the rise of, there was a time of a lot of intergroup violence and hill forts, but then it declined. Does this give you a particular perspective on that?
Well, in Yasawa, it seems like there was violence right up until 19th century European contact. So the first missionaries that arrived in my village were eaten. And the villages were all built on a bluff, so now they're all built on these nice coastal areas, but they're built high up on these mountains, and you can still find the archaeological remains that are unexcavated at this point. And people tell stories about how, various battles that happened, and they talk about these championships. So sometimes villages wouldn't want to fight, and they would each send their champion, and the champions would fight. And they had a plan, apparently, that if their village got overrun, the women were all hanging off a cliff on a net, and they would just cut the net. Because the worst thing to happen, apparently, would be to have your women get caught by the other village. But yeah, so this went right up to contact and basically military arms and. So
it wasn't a large shift in norms necessarily.
Yeah, external, I think the guys with the guns showed up and said, no more war.
So that was really fun. I wanted to pick up on a comment you made at the very beginning of your talk when you said that you wanted to take the approach that we do not need to distinguish institutions from norms.
I think we can cobble up to our understanding of institutions as a collection of social norms.
Okay, that's right. And I wanted your reaction to an approach that Avner Greif, Joel Mokyr, and others are taking, which is also to link norms and institutions, but not definitionally, not to say institutions are a collection of norms, but instead to say that institutions, like formal institutions, have cognitive requirements, and they call them cognitive rules, is the title of a paper by Greif and Mokyr. And the basic idea is you can't have a rule, let's say, that I don't gun down a black kid jaywalking unless you've got an idea that blacks are just like everybody else. That there is a requirement for a cultural category that blacks are just like everybody else in order that you can actually have a functioning institution where people are created equal. It seems very useful to have this distinction between cognitive rules or cultural categories and formal institutions to cobble everything together. I'm not sure.
So, I mean, I think that the thing that we think of as a formal institution can play a role because it can help communicate our shared agreement. So if we imagine everybody's a little bit uncertain, or there's some proportion of the population that's uncertain, having the formal law that's written down and endorsed through time, it can't be kind of manipulated in terms of what this actually meant. We all center around it. So written laws can have real functions, but they're often galvanizing social norms. So if you look at the evolution of contract law or commercial law in Europe, there was a merchant law that preceded that was unwritten. And then gradually, as the lawyers were being created by the new universities, they were trying to figure out how to formalize and systematize this body of social norms that merchants had created for trade. So it's very much organic from the bottom up. We think we can separate it in part because of the European expansion, where you take a European institution and you plunk it down somewhere. But we now know that if you just plunk down the traffic laws of Maryland in Baghdad, people don't start driving like the folks in Maryland.
Hey, so I'd like to contemplate on the concept of norm psychology. And I have two questions. So my first question is, in this process of this gene-culture coevolution, there are cultural effects on norm psychology and there are genetic effects on norm psychology. So do you consider norm psychology as culturally inherited or genetically inherited? This is the first question. And the second question is that norm psychology is addressed as an individual trait. And I wonder whether we can address norm psychology also to groups.
Right. Okay, so I think that norm psychology is co-evolved and that it contains both genetic and cultural components. So, I mean, one of the things that's always challenging when you're an anthropologist is, claims of universality. People love to challenge claims of universality. So I've been going around claiming that, there are two universals, or at least two I care about right now. Cultural learning, so all humans are cultural learners, and all human societies have norms. Now, I've just showed you, I made the case that these norms are stabilized in different ways using these different mechanisms in different societies. So that, I think, does affect people's norm psychology. There's a sense in which children arrive, due to genetic programming, ready to enter a world with social norms, for which there will be rules. When they're broken, will make others angry. But then the details of what happens after that can be very much culturally variable. So I showed you the ultimatum game with the Fijians, where they're just unwilling to punish because that's not how their norm sanctioning system works, so you wouldn't expect to see it in the ultimatum game. So that's a piece of cultural norm psychology that varies across places. But the expectation that you're coming into a world of social rules that you'll need to navigate, I think, is a human universal. I mean, language is built of social norms, right? When somebody gives wrong grammar, we're like, oh, that's not right, and it bothers us even if we can understand the semantics just fine.